Good evening. A great theologian of the Russian tradition, Father George Florovsky, used to say, spiritually we are all Hellenes. I would like to begin tonight by endorsing that statement. And I count it, therefore, a pleasure and an honor to be invited to speak to a society dedicated to Hellenic paedia. Athens and Jerusalem, the classical tradition and the Christian church. That is my theme. And let me begin with a tale of two dreams. St. Jerome, in the early 5th century, himself a Latin father, but deeply influenced by the Greek tradition, recounts how in a dream, or perhaps a waking vision, he once found himself summoned before the divine judgment seat, where he was accused of being more a lover of classical literature than a lover of the Bible, of being a Ciceronian rather than a Christian. And he was condemned in his dream to be flogged with many lashes. That story reflects the ambivalence felt by many early Christians towards the classical tradition. It was something that they found deeply attractive. And yet they feared this attraction as a temptation and a threat. But I would like to come to my second dream, which is rather more cheerful. In the questions of St. Anastasius of Sinai, who died around 700, he tells a story of a scholar whose practice it was daily to curse Plato. Every night before he went to bed he said, "God damn Plato." Eventually, Plato himself appeared to him in a dream and said, "Man, stop cursing me, for you are merely harming yourself. I do not deny that I was a sinner. But when Christ descended into Hades, no one believed in him more quickly than I did." For my part, I greatly prefer the second dream to the first. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have come to talk to you this evening. Yes, between classical Hellenism and Christianity, between Plato and the Greek fathers, there are indeed crucial points of difference, even of possible conflict. But I deeply believe in the end there is convergence rather than contradiction. If Hellas has sometimes proved a dangerous seduction for Christian thinkers, more often it has served as an enrichment. To set our compass this evening, let us begin with St. Paul's visit to Athens and his speech on the Areopagus. This is the place in the New Testament where we find raised most clearly and directly the question of Athens and Jerusalem, of Hellas and Christianity. Paul's advent in Athens, so Luke clearly wishes his readers to understand in Acts chapter 17, is a moment of critical importance. The apostle of the Gentiles has come to preach the Christian faith in a city which had long since ceased to be politically influential, but which was still seen as the center of Greek civilization, and above all the heartland of Greek philosophy. It was the first decisive encounter between the gospel and Hellenism. And on this encounter, the future of Christianity as a world religion depended. How then does Paul begin in his speech on the Areopagus in Acts 17? Not by asserting a sharp discontinuity, a radical antagonism between Hellenism and the message of the gospel, but by indicating their possible agreement. His stance is positive, although it also has negative undertones. While clearly repudiating all idolatry, Paul does not commence by telling the Athenians that they are deluded, but he seeks rather to assure them that they are already in some measure on the path to truth. That is surely a sound diplomatic ploy. If we wish to gain a sympathetic hearing from our audience, is it not prudent to begin by suggesting where they might be right before pointing out their errors? Rather than saying, "You've got it all wrong, you're hopeless," we can say, "Yes, you're quite right about that, but there is more." Yet, in Acts 17, far more is at stake than a mere apologetic strategy. Paul is making a theological and spiritual point of primary importance. The apostle starts then with a reference to the altar to the unknown God. "What you worship but do not know," he says, "this is what I proclaim to you." The Athenians already have a subconscious awareness of the one true God. And this the apostle seeks not to belittle, but to reinforce. The Savior whom he preaches, responds to the deepest yearnings already in the hearts of his pagan audience. Paul appeals next to the fundamental unity of the human race. He has made of one blood every nation of humankind to dwell upon the whole face of the earth. The apostle goes on to speak of God's immanence and omnipresence, insisting in terms parallel to the first chapter of the epistle to the Romans upon the natural knowledge of God accessible to all human beings by virtue of their inherent affinity with the Creator. In him, says Paul, we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Thus far, employing ideas that the Stoics present among his listeners would have found thoroughly familiar, Paul has concentrated upon what Hellenism and Christianity share together. After emphasizing these points of concurrence, however, he then turns to a crucial difference between the two. His speech ends with something that could never have been deduced by natural human reason from philosophical premises, with something to be known solely through God's self-revelation. He ends, that is to say, with the resurrection of Christ from the dead. What began, as to all appearances, a typically Hellenistic oration, terminates with a distinctively Christian conclusion. Paul is fully conscious that his concluding reference to the resurrection will prove perplexing and even scandalous to his cultured audience. But this scandal he has made no attempt to mitigate. Paul's intention then, in the Areopagus speech in Acts 17, as presented by Luke, is to achieve a suitable balance between continuity and discontinuity, while acknowledging the common ground between Hellenic thought and Christianity. He seeks also to do justice to the radical newness of the Christian kerygma. He does not forget that the one who said that he came not to abolish but to fulfill also spoke in his gospel of his gospel as new wine that bursts asunder the old wineskins. The speech on Areopagus makes plain the manner in which Christianity can utilize Greek ideas and yet at the same time transform and pass beyond them. But this task of transformation is far from straightforward, and as Paul himself discovered, can easily meet with incomprehension and mockery. But let us hold fast to Paul's final point, the resurrection of Christ. There is surely one thing that we do not find in Hellenic philosophy, and that is the incarnation. We do not find in the Greek philosophers the statement of John's prologue that the Word was made flesh. That is something new. That God has associated himself with his creation in the closest possible way by himself becoming part of it. That God himself, the eternal Word, the second member of the Holy Trinity, has taken a human soul and a human body, has lived out a life on earth in physical flesh, has died in that body, and has risen again from it. This we do not find in the Hellenic tradition. Now let's look at some typical early Christian writers to see how they handled this question that is raised so strikingly in the book of Acts. Some early Christian writers take a sharply negative view. For example, Tertullian. He is Latin, but deeply influenced by Greek philosophy. And yet he says, in defiant tones, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" For Tertullian, there was a great distance between the two cities. His standpoint can well be summed up in the war cry of the prophet Zechariah: "Your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece." Reacting against Gnosticism, which in common with other early Christian writers, Tertullian regarded as a distortion of the Christian message under the influence of Greek philosophy, he saw in the classical tradition not an ally but an enemy. Rather than rely upon the received wisdom of pre-Christian Hellas, he preferred a theology of paradox. One of his famous sayings is, "Certum est quia impossibile." It is certain because it is impossible. Tertullian's contemporary, Saint Hippolytus of Rome, displayed similar reservations about Greek thought, arguing in his refutation of all the heresies that each heretical sect had deviated from the truth precisely through adopting the tenets of some pagan philosopher. Fortunately, however, this is far from being the universal opinion among early Christian thinkers. And to counterbalance Tertullian, let us look at someone in the generation before him, Justin Martyr, who died in 165. In his two apologies, he sees the gospel and the best elements in Plato and the Stoics as being almost identical ways of apprehending the same truth. He recognized that there were certain points of disagreement between Greek philosophy and the Christian faith, but he was optimistic, indeed over-optimistic, about the prospects of a reconciliation between them. His own spiritual pilgrimage from Stoicism through the schools of Aristotle and Pythagoras to Platonism and so finally to Christianity had involved not a clean break with the past, but a gradual transition. Even after accepting baptism, he did not feel that he had to lay aside the mantle of the Hellenic philosopher. Justin's approach is exactly summed up in the words of the prologue to the fourth Gospel, John 1:9, where it is said that the divine Logos, he was the true light that illumines everyone who comes into the world. Everyone is illumined by the true light. That applies not just to the Jews, but to the Hellenes. Restating the evangelist's message in Stoic terms, Justin argued that Christ the Logos has sown seeds of the truth, logis spermatiki, in every human heart. There is within all human beings a natural power of reason, emphytos logos, that provides them with a partial yet true knowledge of God. The Church, in its Catholicity, takes up all these scattered seeds, nurturing them and bringing them to full maturity. Justin was certainly an opponent of Gnostic syncretism. He considered that the Church could make no compromise with pagan mythology and ritual. But pagan philosophy, as he saw it, stood on an altogether different level, and could act as a valuable handmaid to the Christian faith. The Hellenic thinkers, in Justin's view, had attained a genuine measure of truth. Socrates, as well as Abraham, is to be seen as a Christian before Christ. Whatever then has been rightly expressed by anyone belongs to us, Christians, he concluded. Christianity completes and perfects all the partial truths present in the non-Christian philosophers. It is in this way the absolute philosophy. Now, the same affirmative approach was adopted by Clement of Alexandria, who died around 215. In a beautiful statement, he says, "The way of truth is one, but into it, as into an ever-flowing stream, there run rivulets from different sides. Not by one path alone," he believed, "do we humans approach the inexhaustible plenitude of the truth. The Old Testament occupies, needless to say, a privileged and unique position from the Christian point of view. The Jews are, in a distinctive sense, the chosen people, since it was as a Jew that the Word became flesh. Yet, so Clement insisted, if the Old Testament was a tutor to bring the Jews to the truth, then philosophy was given to the Greeks for the same purpose. There's a double preparation for the incarnation of Christ within Hellenism as well as Judaism. They are both tributaries of the same great waterway. Yes, I was looking today in the center of Richmond at the river. Is it the River James? And that is a marvelous wide river, though it is not very deep. But if it had been deep, Clement could gladly have taken that as a symbol of the truth. According to Clement, then, the Christian may discern in the philosophical tradition of Athens a genuine propaedia, a real praeparatio evangelica. Christ's words, "I am not come to abolish but to fulfill," apply not only to the law and the prophets of Israel, but also to whatever is true in the wisdom of ancient Hellas. I find Clement's approach deeply attractive, though I do sometimes wonder, has he allowed sufficiently for the radical newness of the Christian message? But there are difficulties. And we see these difficulties illustrated especially in the figure of Origen, Clement's successor at Alexandria. Jerome had at one time in his life a high opinion of Origen, calling him the greatest teacher in the church after the apostles. Alas, in later years, during the unhappy controversy with Rufinus, Jerome changed his mind. I'm very willing to agree with St. Vincent of Lerins in the 5th century, who said, "Who would not rather be wrong with Origen than right with anyone else?" Unfortunately, not everybody's taken that positive view. There is a story told about Pachomius, the founder of Cenobitic monasticism in Egypt during the 4th century. One day, some monks came to visit Pachomius, seemingly well educated and devout. But as they talked together, Pachomius became uneasy. He noticed that coming from these well-educated monks, there was a very nasty smell, megali dysodia. And then, suddenly, he discovered the reason for this. These monks were followers of Origen. So Pachomius said to them, "Take the works of Origen and throw them in the river." And so the conversation ended. Unfortunately, that's exactly what a lot of people have done. So, for the most part, we don't have Origen's writings in the original Greek, but only in Latin translation. Now, Origen got into trouble because under Platonist influence, though his relation to Plato is quite complicated, he affirmed the pre-existence of souls, and he asserted that there had been a pre-cosmic fall. It was only after this pre-cosmic fall that the souls were given bodies as a punishment. He also expected a final apokatastasis, or restoration of all things, in which every rational being, including even the devil, would eventually be reconciled to God. He was furthermore accused of accepting reincarnation, but this was probably not the case. Now, on these and other points where Origen, in the eyes of his detractors, had deviated from orthodoxy, it was their conviction that he had been unduly influenced by Greek philosophy. To later generations, Origen served as a melancholy example of the hazards of too great an openness to Hellenic thought. How then are we to find the true balance? Where is the line to be drawn? Which are the aspects of the classical tradition that constitute a danger to the Christian message? And which are the things that can serve to elucidate and enhance it? In this context, it may be helpful to distinguish three levels, connected but distinct. First, there is the level of paideia, of lifestyle, culture, and education. Here, most Christians in the ancient world found little difficulty in drawing confidently upon the Hellenic heritage. A notable example of a constructive attitude towards Greek literature is provided by the treatise entitled To the Young, written by St. Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century, written for his nephews and perhaps also for his nieces. True and sure wisdom, he says, is to be found only in Holy Scripture. But to prepare our minds for biblical study, Greek literature serves as an excellent progymnasia, or preliminary training. Discernment is, of course, needed. As Basil says, accept only what is useful and recognize what should be ignored. Basil makes it clear, however, that for the most part the examples set before us in the Greek classics are definitely beneficial. After describing, for instance, the patience of Socrates in the face of ill treatment, he concludes, since these actions correspond almost exactly to our own ideals, it is of great value to imitate them. Admittedly, the Greek and Latin fathers firmly rejected certain elements in the pagan way of life, such as homosexuality. But on the whole, as regards this first level, that of paideia, they perceived what Basil calls ikiotes, affinity, rather than opposition. Secondly, turning more specifically to the realm of philosophy, we need to distinguish form from content, although needless to say, the two cannot be altogether separated. On the level of terminology and argumentation, in its employment of technical terms, definitions, and methods of reasoning, Christian theology owes a manifest debt to the Greek philosophical tradition. We have only to recall, for example, the use made by the fathers of such words as ousia, essence, physis, nature, hypostasis, person, when developing the doctrine of the Trinity and the Incarnation. In their reliance on these terms, however, patristic writers at the same time adapted and deepened their meaning. When, for example, the 4th century Cappadocians or St. Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century discussed the concepts of hypostasis and prosopon, they formulated what may be seen as a subtler and more dynamic ontology of personhood than is to be found in Hellenic philosophy. But then let's come to the third level, the most decisive. How far has Christian theology been influenced by the Greek philosophies? Not only as regards to its terminology and outward form, but also as regards its inner content. It is here, on this third level, that the problematic of Athens and Jerusalem becomes more acute. And the Greek philosopher, who above all others has acted as a challenge and a stimulus on this level, who has been experienced by Christian thinkers both as an attraction and as a snare, is none other than Plato. Somebody seems to disapprove of what I'm saying. That's maybe better. Luke tells us that Paul's audience on the Areopagus consisted of Stoics and Epicureans, but for Christian theology, the crucial encounter has been the interface not with Stoicism and Epicureanism, nor yet with Aristotelianism, but with Platonism. Now, there are many things in Platonism that Christians have been able to draw upon and make positive use of. First of all, I think of Plato's theory of forms or ideas. His affirmation that there exists beyond this visible world a transcendent world of eternal truth. Now, Christianity can certainly draw on this, especially if, as the early fathers did, we see the realm of forms as being ideas in the mind of God. Secondly, the Platonists emphasized the divine mystery. They emphasized that God is beyond our understanding. And in this way, they are an important source for Christian apophatic theology. Thirdly, we find in Platonism the understanding of the intellect, the nous. This the Platonists regarded as a faculty superior to the reason, to our discursive power of constructing syllogisms and deducing conclusions from premises. The reason they referred to as diania or dianoia. But the nous was higher than this. It was a power, it is a power of direct insight, of inner vision, whereby we appreciate the truth not as the conclusion of a reasoned argument, but in a sudden flash. We just see that something is true. This idea of the nous has been taken over in Christian anthropology and has a long and important history. The basic problem, I think, with Platonism is twofold. First, Platonism fails to distinguish adequately between the uncreated and the created. It does not have a doctrine of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. The Platonists, the Neoplatonists also, such as Plotinus, posit a series of emanations from the divine, a gradually descending hierarchy of being, but no doctrine of creation out of nothing. The highest element in the human soul is understood to be not merely formed in the image and likeness of the Godhead, but itself to be by nature divine. And here I recall the dying words of Plotinus: strive to bring back the God within yourselves to the divine in the universe. Quite a complex statement for a dying man. Secondly, seen in a biblical perspective, Platonism fails to allow sufficiently for the spirit-bearing potentialities of material things, and more especially for the spiritual value of the human body. And here I come back to what I said earlier. We do not find in Platonism a doctrine of the incarnation, of the flesh-taking of God. It is true that Platonism is not dualist in any crude and unqualified sense. Indeed, Plotinus attacks the Gnostics precisely on the ground that they regard the material universe as the handwork of evil powers. But Platonism, even if it does not consider matter to be intrinsically evil, yet holds that it lacks true reality, a more subtle form of dualism, but nonetheless unacceptable for the Christian theologian. To the Platonist, the real person is the soul, while the body is discounted as extrinsic to authentic personhood. It is a prison, a tomb, a piece of temporary clothing. The body is the soul's tunic, states a Pythagorean epitaph, with which the Platonists would not disagree. It was even said of Plotinus that he seemed to be ashamed of being in a body. And he wouldn't tell anybody when his birthday was. He said, the occasion for my soul entering a material body is a cause for lamentation rather than celebration. He also wouldn't let anybody paint his portrait. I sympathize with him. I don't like being photographed all the time, but I put up with it. There was once a professor at London University who, in Platonist fashion, emphasized the distinction between the body and the soul. Professor H.D. Lewis, not to be confused with C.S. Lewis. And his students used to say, Professor Highwell Lewis does not go for a walk, he takes his body for a walk. Now that, as we know, is not the Christian approach. For the Old and the New Testament, the body is the soul in its outward form. Man does not have a body, he is a body. Where Platonism affirms the immortality of the soul, the Bible affirms the resurrection of the body. As Michael Koniates said in the 13th century, the term anthropos, human being, is applied neither to the soul alone nor to the body alone, but to both of them together. And so it is with reference to them both that God is said to have created the human being in his image. St. Paul, of course, had said the same 12 centuries earlier. Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Glorify God in your body. 2 Corinthians 6, 19 to 20. And then again, Romans 12:1, I beseech you, brothers and sisters, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice to God. As St. Maximus the Confessor maintains, our body is deified along with our soul. By nature, we remain entirely human in our soul and in our body, but by grace we become entirely God in our soul and in our body. We find in Platonism many things that may help us in our Christian theology, but we don't find that. St. Cyril of Jerusalem, in the 4th century, in his definition of the term Catholic, distinguishes two dimensions of meaning in the word. There is first the exterior and quantitative sense. The Church is Catholic because it extends throughout the world from one end of the earth to the other, embracing the whole human race. But alongside this extensive meaning, there is also an intensive meaning, a qualitative sense. The Church is Catholic because it contains and teaches all the healing fullness of salvation. Faithful to the second, richer meaning of the word Catholic, the Church welcomes and makes its own all truth wherever it is to be found. That is what St. Paul did in his speech to the Athenians on the Areopagus. That is what St. Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria would have us do. And that is what Christians today are also called to attempt, if they seek to be humanists in the correct sense of the word, without compromising the utter newness of the revelation brought by Christ. We need to acknowledge also the continuity between classical Hellas and the gospel. With good reason, in the wall paintings of Byzantine churches, Plato and Aristotle are included among the prophets. Athens and Jerusalem are not implacable foes. They can and should be fellow workers, partners, and friends.